but I have poems from the first 77 Dream songs. So when John Berryman, started getting he was famous, I guess, to a degree as a poet before, but it's the 77 Dream songs, right, that he first published that kind of, set the stage for, this idea that he was just doing something completely new in poetry, right? The idea that this was kind of like modernism in a sense, going full circle. You were getting all the kind of abstractions of modernism, but applied to something that, in many respects, I think is kind of immediately intelligible. I've had people tell me that the Dream songs are very complex, difficult to understand, and I guess to some degree this is the case. Although I think more than anything, what happens with the Dream songs is people get way too caught up in the idea that they need to understand every line, they need to understand every reference, and that's not something that's ordinarily done with Hart Crane. It's not something that's ordinarily done with Wallace Stevens, who they could be just as obscure, but I'm guessing the difference is, if it's quote unquote confessional poetry, the expectation is that people understand it right away. And I think you can, but you have to sort of get away from the idea that there's going to be a very distinct chronology to the poems. There's going to be, I don't want to say narrative, but that there's going to be a plot that unfolds in some kind of, easy way. But it's also, I think, been understated with the Dream songs how much it is structurally tight, right? There is a narrative there, and in fact, like the reason why I start, for example, with Dream song number 1 is, I mean, it sets the tone for the rest of the book, right? Like this is telling you the conflicts. This gives you hints of what's going to come after. It gives you a glimpse into the style, gives you a glimpse into the kind of preoccupations, not only of, I guess, John Berryman, but specifically like the Henry character, right? And there's some distinctions between Henry and John Berryman. So it's just important to keep that part in mind. But anyway, before we get to the poems themselves, I don't normally want to do this sort of thing, but so much in the Dream songs has been sort of like baked into Berryman's biography and vice versa, right? The biography is being baked into the poems. We're going to go over some interviews that he did on this matter, but because, like, at minimum, since like the critical consensus is, going back like I guess 5 decades at this point, Henry is John Berryman. The Dream songs are like all about his life. Whether or not that's true is not so relevant as the fact that this is kind of the critical consensus, and this is sort of what we have to deal with and get through. So I want to actually just give some of the background, right? Because even if we concede Berryman's objection that, hey, this Henry character that seems to superficially have my life, right, based on what's known about my biography, despite this kind of superficial similarity, like we could concede that, let's just assume that it's not him. The fact is, like, if you have some kind of biography to work with, even if it's not, true, right? Even if Henry's not John Berryman, simply having that biography to work with ensures that if something happens in the poem that is obscure, if something happens in the poem that is, it's some other way, I guess, difficult to follow, difficult to understand, having those biographical details means you're going to get at least one layer of interpretation available to you, right? You could ultimately say that, hey, this isn't exactly where I want to go with my interpretations, but simply having that layer, right, means that you could build on that initial superficial reading, right? You have something there structurally. You have something there that's tangible. You have something there that you could latch onto, right? If your brain is looking for something that it could hold on to, like if you're finding these poems intimidating, the biography is, it could be anything, but you might as well just use the biography, right? Because just having that tangible piece will make a lot of this easier. And ultimately, you could sort of throw that overboard. You could say, I started with the sort of biographical sketches, and now I'm ready to turn that overboard. Now I'm ready to see where the Henry character might diverge, not only from Berryman, like the real life poet, but just diverge from critical consensus, diverge from biography, obviously, diverge even from poem to poem, right? Henry is not necessarily the same. So let's just kind of build that base, right? We're going to start. We're going to end up, at the peak of a pyramid, but we need to get this foundation down, right? So that at a minimum, right, the rest isn't so tough going. So there's this article that I found the last couple of days. This is from 2014, remembering the poet John Berryman in his centennial year. Kind of hard to believe that this was fall of 2014. And I'm guessing partly because in the, if he was born 1914, it's been now at this point, more than a century. And yet, he's still so incredibly modern, right? That, this is, and I often marvel at this kind of thing, right? I said the same thing about, William Blake when I did a couple of those streams, right? There's something about William Blake that is just kind of conceptually ahead. I wouldn't necessarily say that Berryman is sort of conceptually ahead, but more so, technique wise, the fact that he showed that grammatically you could sort of do whatever you want. Meaning wise, units of meaning, units of sense, units of tone, right? Even if it's not clear meaning, he just approaches that in an interesting way. But, you do have to, maybe it's just I'm getting older, right? But you do have to come to terms with the fact that this is more than a century now. And when you look at sort of published poetry today, you just sort of have to ask, what is the new stuff, right? What is being done to build upon what Berryman did? And for the most part, when it comes to published poetry, I think the answer is not much, unfortunately. So let's just go through his biography in this kind of, celebration of his work from a few years back. So for those that are not watching the video and you're just listening to this, hopefully by the time that this is all clipped nicely for you, the audio will be even better. So biography, right? So I don't want to read this whole thing, but the scene is Robert Lowell presenting this guy, right? John Berryman, that not everybody knew what he looked like. Not everybody, I guess, was aware that when Lowell was going to be introducing his friend and a fellow poet, perhaps not many people expected this to be this kind of, unkempt, drunk person, right? So this is how that scene is set. The drunken, bearded author was John Berryman. I'm not sure what this apostrophe 36cc was. Born in McAlester, Oklahoma in 1914, Berryman had become, by the age of 49, a world-class Shakespeare scholar. But he was primarily a poet, one who fancied himself on par with Robert Lowell and Elizabeth Bishop, even if readers had yet to catch on. The dream songs would change that. This Henry was an impish creation, like a Shakespearean fool or a truth-telling country yokel. At a reading at the University of Iowa in 1968, Berryman said of Henry, "He's a white middle-aged man who has suffered an irreversible loss, and who is also spoken to in a Negro dialect by a white friend wearing blackface, who calls him at times Mr. Bones." And this is probably like the most controversial part of his poetry. I'm actually gonna, as the stream goes on, I have a couple of things open here, right? Going through this idea of blackface, right? Trying to trying to find something that anyway, I'll get to it when I get to it. I'll show you why it's controversial. Henry's accused of being me, and I am accused of being Henry, and I deny it, and nobody believes me, Berryman told the Paris Review in an interview published in 1972. He got the name from his second wife, Elizabeth Ann. They'd asked each other what names they most despised. He said Mabel. She said Henry. So this is like perhaps where some of the biographical stuff is going to be useful for this poem. Like, you know, even if it's not the case, right? Let's just assume for now, as we're building this foundation, as we're looking for something to attach ourselves to so that we're not like unmoored from this poetry. Let's just assume that this part is correct, right? His wife, and he had many wives, and, you know, just an entire kind of a sad process of a life in that way. Like the fact that he would name this character after a despised name, and also like in some senses be a stand-in for himself. I mean, that like the way that the figure is presented as kind of pathetic, as kind of belligerent, as kind of wild. You know, in some ways, I guess, like you could say that in that superficial way, there's a bit of a John Berryman in the Henry character. Right. And, you know, like just think of like any possible insights into his personal, you know, he's willing to present himself as, you know, in a sense, like his wife's like worst nightmare, right? Maybe superficially so, maybe kind of in a deeper sense. I mean, I think the majority of them actually left him. So, you know, he probably is not unaware, right? Not unaware of how you know, others perceived him and the kind of damage that he did all around his life. To complicate this matter of names, Berryman wasn't born Berryman. He was John Allen Smith Jr. until John Allen Smith Sr., a banker, died of a gunshot to the heart by the steps of the family apartment in Tampa, Florida in 1926. It was written up as a suicide, although Berryman's classmate, the publisher Robert Giroux, would later speculate that Berryman's mother, Martha, may have murdered him. Paul Mariani, in his 1990 biography of Berryman, Dream Song, that's the book that I bought recently. I haven't, I've read some of it, I haven't fully gone through it, but anyway, the biography notes that the characteristic powder burn of a self-inflicted wound was missing from Smith Sr.'s shirt. Moreover, Martha had motive. She wanted to divorce Smith and marry their landlord, John Berryman, and Smith was made. But the Tampa Police Department barely looked at the case. Florida was in the middle of a real estate bust in 1926, and many ruined businessmen were killing themselves. I find this detail about, like, you know, was this a suicide? Was it a murder? I find it interesting, if only in the sense that, I mean, this is like, you know, this is like a literary trope at this point, isn't it? Right? Like we have, you know, the Ted Hughes versus Sylvia Plath. You know, was she driven to this suicide? Did he egg her on in some way, knowing that, you know, on the one hand, I'm sure Ted Hughes understood that he was a far inferior poet to Sylvia Plath, and who knows what that did to him psychologically. But I mean, we have the same stuff with, like, you know, Kurt Cobain, and, you know, was he in fact, was it a suicide that he killed himself? You know, or was he killed by his girlfriend at the time? We have the same thing, and Elliott Smith is going to come up actually later in this stream when I do a comparison with an Elliott Smith song to one of the Dream songs. Same thing, right? Did Elliott Smith kill himself? Or was he in fact murdered, in this case stabbed, by his girlfriend at the time? And I mean, you know, it's just like, you know, this kind of narrative, right? Like the responsible party, right? You know, oftentimes the spouse, like, jealousy involved, whatever. I just it's not it's not relevant to the poems, right? And as far as like any reality, it seems to me like you will never get to the bottom of this now. So what's the point of worrying about it anyway? Such personal themes as loss, infatuations, and hangovers, which occur throughout the dream songs, typify what is known as the confessional style, though this was a label Berryman rejected. He rejected all labels, wanting simply to be known as a great poet. Up until the early 20th century, poetry, at least poetry written in English, was supposed to be about lofty themes like love and war and nature and religion and beauty. Writing about familiar, intimate things like shoes and boredom and money and anxiety was taboo. As Columbia poetry professor William Wadsworth points out, Theodore Roethke's 1942 poem, My Papa's Waltz, was the first to focus wholly on a poet's parents. And by the way, like the interesting part is like, I don't know to what degree confessional poetry was in fact truly controversial. I don't know how much of this is just kind of like people in 2014 looking back. Well, this was written in 2014, right? So looking back. But anyway, and I mean, Dan Schneider talks about this too, right? And even like before Dan pointed this out, I remember when I first read Roethke's My Papa's Waltz. And then I as a teen, like I came across as a teenager, right? And as I was going over the poem, and I was like, let me find some context, let me find biography, let me find other analyses of this poem. I still do that now a lot now, even though I feel a lot less dependent on other people's analyses. But I was looking for analyses, and it just struck me as kind of amazing how this thing, right, this poem, which was supposed to be in that sense, I guess, personal, right, a poem that is supposed to talk about childhood that had like sort of non-PC elements, right, which is, like his father sort of, I wouldn't say getting drunk, but the dad drinking a bit, and then the dad and the son dancing together. That was taken as evidence of, some sort of like child abuse, right? Not only for the fact of the drinking, which again, it shouldn't necessarily be controversial. I guess the issue is whether or not you as a father are in fact getting drunk around your kids versus if you had a drink. But other, pieces of the poem, like every time he'd step, my fist would hit a buckle. I think that's the line. Like that was taken as an example of child abuse. So I guess like whether or not this is like a retrospective analysis that doesn't really capture how confessional poetry was approached by the literati. At minimum, like you could sort of say that with the advent of confessional poetry, suddenly you could have this influx of bad criticism. You could have this influx of, things that people perhaps really shouldn't care about all that much, but do and will care about. Actually, let me make that. Sorry if you guys like were trying to read and I prevented you. Anyway. So like with the advent of confessional poetry, I'm positive what happened was you had like a bunch of like really annoying, like, the guy who would write about poetry for like some paper, right? Whatever the, a small time equivalent was of like New York Times Review of Books, or, whatever like New York led poetry, literary reviews there might have been, whatever magazines that were around. I'm sure that tons of these like, liberal types were out there, like, looking for some kind of analysis, right? Looking for something about confessional poetry that, allowed them to like latch onto analyses that didn't make sense. Like people still do it all the time now. Like it's perhaps like it feels more pernicious now, but I mean, the way that this poem was interpreted in the 40s, right? Or the way that, Berryman was approached pretty much from the beginning of the dream songs, right? At least when it comes to some of the like some of the dissent. I think, there might be something to this, but I'm just like going off in this like long digression, simply to remind whoever's watching this that, hey, however however a narrative makes sense, keep in mind that 50, 60 years after the fact, there is so much that gets added in, and there's so much that gets spruced up, and there's so much like a post hoc analysis that would have never been able to fly back then. It's like that Auden line, the words of the dead are like rearranged in the guts of the living, right? And in this case, it's not the words. It could even be, the sum total, interpretation. So let's just, and this is going to be especially important, like when we get to the blackface, when we look at like the modern sort of, academic, approaches to all that now, like in the last 20 years, right? You could imagine it being a bit of a nightmare for a poet that wants to actually be understood. So for Berryman, Papa is at the center of all things. Maybe, right? So we're building the foundation. You could make that assumption. But as we're going through it, right, and this idea keeps coming up in the various critiques that we're going to read, Papa at the center of things, that may be true. It's a perfectly valid way to read it. Some kind of Papa, like some kind of like I'm not sure, like the one where there's this like image of like Henry's dad, I think, sort of like swimming away into this kind of like horizon, which is like supposed to be what is like the sublime dead, the dead sublime. Yeah, the dead sublime is the phrase, the dead sublime. That could easily be a reference to a father, but this thing that is generically Papa, this could be any number of forces. This could be a more anonymous force. And, as I'll discuss, it's not just a response to a death. It's not just a response to, a physical loss. Like, you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into that interpretation. But again, let's start with that as a foundation for this pyramid that we're going to build. Alan Gilbert, a poet and critic who teaches a seminar at Columbia called Post-War American Poetry, says his favorite lines of Berryman are in Dream Song 241. Father being the loneliest word in the one language, and a word only, a fraction of sun and guns. Dream Song 384 refers to his father's suicide more directly. I spit upon this dreadful banker's grave, who shot his heart out in a Florida dawn, right? I mean, whether or not you, and we're not going to go through Dream Song 384. Again, we're ending at the first book that he published with the Dream Songs, which was 77 Dream Songs. So we're going to go through the first 77. But I mean, we know that his father is a banker. We know that the assumption is that he killed himself. It seems that Berryman believes that. Whether or not it's true is immaterial. So in a superficial level, like we could talk about Berryman, or we could talk about a Henry figure responding to something vaguely that Berryman went through himself. Like all of the confessionalists, Berryman sought to disturb the intricately wrought, self-contained poem that was the dominant mode of the 1950s, Gilbert says. This kind of poetry eschewed overtly biographical, social, and historical references. It could also be dry and academic, more concerned with crafting intricately wrought allusions and delivering an emotional punch. But Berryman's poems were a little more intense than the usual lyrical confessional poem. Oftentimes, not always. And it's also, it also matters what you mean by confessional. Perhaps as a movement, yes, right? We could date it in a specific way, but the kinds of things like we're going to go over, like Helen Wendler would say, and others would say, it strikes me as a little bit like you're trying to constrain things a touch too much. If you're just gonna view confessionalism as that specific movement in American poetry, right? 50s, 60s, whatever. because if you go further back, like you're gonna get, obviously, right? Obviously, you're gonna get confessional strains in Whitman. You're gonna get confessional strains in William Blake. You're gonna get confessional strains in, obviously, John Donne, right? And this is centuries before. So the question is, it's like, well, we know John Donne, we know Blake, we know what they were up to, we know what Whitman were up to. How would we push like the confessional vein, right? What can we do with this idea that the like poetry is like a way to, on the one hand, relieve ourselves of like biography, I guess, in a sense, and then on the other hand, actually make it worthwhile and make it something beyond like mere biography. Here was a man, a scholar deeply embedded within the literary establishment, who shambled on stage wearing rubby glasses and a wild beard, sodden with drink, inhabiting a character so obviously based on himself and his horrendous family life, speaking strangled sentences so emotionally painful that his voice was little more than a croak. Where had he found Henry's squealing, slurring voice? How had he tapped this nerve? As a college student, Berryman had mentors who pushed him toward the study of literature, a pursuit that was just compelling enough to distract him from the memories of his father and his father's cuckolder, Uncle Jack Berryman, and the relentless monologues of his increasingly mad mother, who changed her name from Martha Smith to Jill Angel Berryman. Berryman often asked his mother to tell him about the day his father died, but she always obfuscated and poured new poisons on his father's memory. I'm not sure if this actually, I haven't read the whole thing actually. I read some of it to know where to start, where to end, but I'm not sure if they get into like the rest of the biography. But so his father's suicide, I believe it came just like a few months after his mother was cheating on his father. The father discovered this, and they both decided to proceed with a divorce. And actually, like in the court proceedings, like who knows if it's true or false, but both alleged infidelity, one against the other. You could see how somebody like John Berryman could ultimately be this kind of like philanderer just by seeing only his mother cheat on his father, or both of them in this kind of like mutually abusive relationship. And by the way, so like the person, so like the way that this happened was like they were in the 20s, right? They it was the father, the mother, and one of their in-laws decided to create this. They decided to open up a restaurant. After they opened up the restaurant, within like 7 months, they had to close it at a loss. And the place that they were living at the time, there was this like landlord in this kind of like, I guess it was a somewhat of a fancy set of apartment buildings, and she was cheating on him with that landlord. And within a few months after the divorce, and I think after the suicide, maybe before the suicide, but like shortly, right? Like within a few months of the divorce, at least, she remarried the stepfather. I forget the relationship. I'm not sure if Berryman had a good or bad relationship with his stepfather, but anyway, just to like put some context into all that. Despite getting carried, and by the way, guys, watching this, if you're just tuning to the stream randomly, right? If you're just seeing this on YouTube and you're not subscribed, if you like what you see so far, right? If you like this idea of going through these dream songs and understanding what this is about, and going through these fucking critics and going through this, like we're gonna be here all fucking night, okay? And if you like this, hit like. If you want more of this, just take a look at the channel. As always, see if there's anything out there, sort of like what I'm trying to do with this channel. If you like what you see, again, please hit like, please subscribe, and enjoy the show. Anyway, despite getting carried away with drink at Columbia, his antics, Mariani writes, included crashing a faculty dance with 3 friends, then escaping a security guard by sliding down a banister. And almost flunking his junior year, his scholarship was rescinded when he was asked to take the semester off. Berryman rebounded. With the help of Professor Mark Van Doren's, Berryman not only graduated, plowing through and annotating 16 books of 18th century literature in 5 days. Wait, let me understand that. Berryman not only graduated, plowing through and annotating 16 books of 18th century literature in 5 days. That's a pretty fast rate of reading. I always get jealous when I see people read this quickly because I'm a very slow reader. For example, I was preparing all day for this stream, but had the energy to play a nursemaid in Belle in the 1936 Varsity Show, published 2 poems in the Columbia Review, and win a Eureka K. Kellett Fellowship to sail to England and read literature at Clare College, Cambridge. Berryman lived most of his life as a transient academic, drifting from contract to contract. At Princeton, where he taught for 10 years beginning in 1943, he became friends with Lowell and Saul Bellow, and although he published books of poems in 1942 and 48, he wasn't nearly as recognized as his contemporaries. For decades, he was better known as a Shakespeare scholar. He received a Rockefeller Fellowship during the Second World War to work on King Lear, and spent years editing and standardizing the varied original quartos and folios. This close attention to the mechanical workings of Shakespeare's poetry shaped his work as a poet. Of course, although, even if this is obviously the case, right, you can't escape what you read, right? What you read, will be what you'll come to write, and what you come to write is inevitably more or less what you read. Just keep in mind though, like how, like if you say like a Shakespearean influence, I mean, okay, but where, right? Like, what are you looking at exactly? Is it the Shakespearean melodrama that, kind of like, I don't want to say invades, because it didn't much invade Shakespeare and it didn't invade the dream songs. It was, useful obviously for both poets, but it's hard to really pin that down, right? It's there, but it, like art has a way of working on you where, if you're an artist and you are willing to take on as many influences as possible, if you're an artist and you're actually good at what you do, these influences, they're gonna get like, I don't want to say misshapen, but they will be misshapen, by the facts of the matter, right? They'll be filtered through who you are as a writer, who you are as an artist, and these influences are going to look very different. So the dream songs were his version of a Shakespearean sonnet, Wadsworth says. Berryman took Elizabethan syntax and applied it to modern English, sometimes, all right? Sometimes, resulting in a wrenched syntax. The attempt to join modern English with the rules of early modern verse. Berryman had a vast vocabulary and used multiple layers of diction to create his songs. As a teacher, Berryman nurtured many poets, including Pulitzer Prize winner Philip Levin, who wrote about his experience studying Berryman at Iowa in an essay called Mine Own John Berryman. Right, so this is kind of, I guess, the Elizabethan feel. Even though Berryman had once sneaked up behind him and whacked him with a Scotch bottle, Levin had dared to ask him to stop running his hand up his wife's skirt. Oh, I remember this comment. Levin also, I think, punched him in the face while this was happening. It actually happened twice. Same party. And he was like grabbing under his wife's skirt twice. Weird guy. Levin recalls his experience as Berryman's student fondly, saying Berryman took his class with a seriousness I'd never seen before. Here was this brilliant man preparing for each of our classes and letting us know that what we were doing is immensely important. The dream songs, written over a period from 55 to 69 while he was teaching at the University of Minnesota, made Berryman famous, but he kept innovating, his later work becoming more prose-like. Is 69 the last? I think 69 was. I get the feeling that the last of the dream songs were in the early 70s. He died in 72. Anyway, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the last was 1969. Because the reason why I brought that up is I'm not so sure if like the latter dream songs I would call prose like. I guess maybe to the extent that a lot of the poems themselves are already prose like from the beginning, but I don't know. Unfortunately, his drinking continued. Alice Quinn, who was the executive director of the Poetry Society of America and an adjunct professor at the School of the Arts, describes how a friend of hers spotted Berryman before a reading at Bard College, drinking with others at a local bar, and was, quote, so ashamed because no one was attempting to curb him in any way. During the reading, he was devastated with drink. In 1971, Berryman, motivated in part by the birth of his third child and the threats of his third wife, Kate, to leave him, managed to quit drinking for 11 months. Oh, wow, it's pretty amazing if you're a lifelong alcoholic. Makes me wonder what happens at the 12th month. Why? But quitting was torture, flooding him with physical and spiritual pain. He was trying to write a novel called Recovery, but it wasn't coming through. Ultimately, I don't think Recovery was ever truly finished. I think he left a bunch of stuff unfinished, right? So we got a bunch of fragments from 72. Mariani reports that Berryman's boss in Minnesota, Ralph Ross, saw him that summer, and in a letter to their friend Alan Tate, noted Berryman's lack of warmth, concluding, quote, the only John one could love was John with 2 or 3 drinks in him, no more, no less, and such a John could not exist. On January 5th, 1972, Berryman relapsed. After writing a note to his wife that read, I am a nuisance, he strolled out onto the Washington Avenue Bridge in Minneapolis, which overlooked a chunk of rock. In what would be a dress rehearsal, he climbed over the railing, clutching the knife with which he planned, as Mariani describes it, to slash his throat so that he would feel faint and have to pitch forward. He even wrote a sonnet beforehand describing how he would do it, quote, unless my wife wouldn't let me out of the house, unless the cops noticed me crossing the campus up to the bridge and clapped me in for observation, costing my job. The next day, he walked out on the bridge to complete the act, but a friend spotted him and they talked books for a few minutes and he lost his nerve. The day after, he walked 3/4 of the way across the bridge, climbed the rails again, and tipped over the railing, not needing the knife. He battered himself against a rock, rolled down a small slope, and was swept away into the icy flow of the Mississippi. Okay, so if this foundation in the pyramid makes sense to you, if this, what you know of the dream songs thus far, if you read them before, if you read some of them before, if you don't know what to expect, if this allows you like an end to understanding, I mean, use it, right? There's nothing wrong, right? Like technically as readers, we're not supposed to merely read biographical fact into what we see in the writing itself, right? We're supposed to assume that the thing is fiction, right? In some way, right? We're supposed to assume that writers and artists more broadly are going to lie to you, are going to try to fictionalize things or to mythologize things. But again, for the purposes of something that is difficult, right? We're not dealing with perfection yet. We're dealing with finding a foundation, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? There's no shame in requiring that for yourself. So if this biography helps you, if reading this helps you understand the dream songs, go ahead. But just keep in mind that as good as the biography is for understanding at least kind of like the plot elements of what's going on, and the more I guess obscure parts, we're gonna try to move past that fairly quickly as well. Okay, so let us. Oh well, first I'm gonna take questions, right? So if you have any questions so far about the biography, anything else, whatever, put them in now, and let's see what you guys have. So as I said earlier, John Berryman, he ultimately had 385 dream songs. The first 77 were probably the most famous book that he did at the time. I know that, even in terms of like critical consensus, the first 77 dream songs were, it was like his peak, right? His earlier poetry, if you look at it, like if you get his collected poems or whatever, a lot of it is, if not derivative, a lot of it just sort of feels like, like very kind of like we said earlier, prosaic poems. Well, I mean, they were a lot more prosaic in a negative sense, I guess. 70, like he had like some breaks from like his like kind of like younger days, I guess, his younger styles, but with 77 Dream Songs, that was like the peak, right? So he finally, I think he won a Pulitzer explicitly for that publication. Robert Lowell had this kind of, I mean, it was, I guess, in some ways an interesting article, if only for the sense that Robert Lowell, and you could sort of read that now. If you put in a New York Review of Books plus Robert Lowell plus 77 Dream Songs, you're going to get that review. It's not interesting enough to read the whole thing, so that's not actually one of the pieces that we're going to read. Although, like, you would sort of expect that a good poet writing about a contemporary and a friend, would be interesting enough, I guess. But to me, it wasn't that interesting. So, but Robert Lowell, even in that review, like he makes a couple of mistakes. He conflates the Mr. Bones name, right, with like with Henry's friend, right? This anonymous figure that's in blackface, when in fact Mr. Bones is the kind of name that is used for Henry himself. So just imagine, right? This is like, just imagine that kind of as Berryman, right? Like this would be the place where your life is leading up to, right? These are going to be your among your best poems, right? Not that he didn't have great poems before or after, but this is kind of like where your life is headed. So as we sort of bring in that kind of biographical understanding before we ultimately sort of overturn it and try to transcend it, let's sort of keep that context in mind, right? This is where he's sort of, let's say, going for the gold, right? He was getting tired of himself. He was getting tired of, he used to say, I wanted to be Yeats, right? I wanted to be Dylan Thomas, which, anyway, starting with poem number 1, right? So this is how the Dream Songs open. And like I said earlier, I'm starting with number 1 because you'll see that there's structurally, there's a reason to start with 1. Like people complain about the Dream Songs that they're completely disconnected from one another, but they're not, right? Number 1 is clearly the first Dream Song. If you go through all those Dream Songs, maybe you could find, another poem that could sort of be a stand-in, but I don't think it's as good as a stand-in for the beginning of the text, as much as Dream Song number 1. So, take that for what it's worth. There is a clear narrative here. There is, if not continuity, at least enough, continuous breaks, right? And enough like continuous chunks that you could sort of piece it together in a way that makes sense, right? It's like that line from that rapper A$AP Rock from his song Daylight. All I ever wanted was to pick apart the day and put the pieces back together my way. So this is essentially what you have to do, right, with the Dream Songs. And this is what Berryman himself recommended, right? He said that there is this narrative connection, cross dimensions, but put it back into pieces that make sense. And to me, Dream Song number 1 very much makes sense as the start. So without further ado, Dream Song number 1. Huffy Henry hid the day. Unappeasable Henry sulked. I see his point, a trying to put things over. It was the thought that they could do it made Henry wicked in a way. But he should have come out and talked. All the world like a woolen lover once did seem on Henry's side. Then came a departure. Thereafter, nothing fell out as it might or ought. I don't see how Henry, pride open for all the world to see, survived. What he has now to say is a long wonder the world can bear and be. Once in a sycamore I was glad all the top, and I sang. Hard on the land wears the strong sea, and empty grows every bed. So I feel like just like verbalizing the poem, right? If you are one of those people that finds the Dream Songs kind of difficult, I feel like, just just take it out and just read these poems, right? Read them as if they're being spoken. Read them perhaps with a little bit of a drunken slur. Maybe, you could even get drunk yourself and try to see if there's connections there that you otherwise would miss. But I think this is clearly a beginning. And why do I say that, right? First Dream Song, we get so much anticipation of what's going to come after, right? So, like first line, right? For those that are only hearing this or not watching it, Huffy Henry hid, and we have a series of spaces. I think it's 4 spaces. So there's a lot of playing with punctuation. There's a lot of playing with, like we said earlier, syntax and whatnot. So you get a lot of like that. So Huffy Henry hid space, the day, comma. Well, before you even know anything, about the rest of this character, right? And just starting with that kind of biographical foundation that we talked about earlier, why would this character that seems to be like some sort of protagonist here, even if he's not an I, right? That comes later. What does it mean that he's going to hide the day, right? There's already some sort of, subterfuge, right? There is already some sort of, there's secrecy, right? There's this feeling of, Henry wants to hide maybe from himself, from others. Maybe he wants to hide himself from others. Maybe there is some kind of insecurity, a kind of like not being able to deal with whatever, right? Which obviously sets the stage for the rest of the dream songs if you read them. Unappeasable Henry sulked, right? And this word, right? If Henry is supposed to be his ex-wife's most despised name, right? We have that on the one hand. Then we have this characterization that he's sulking, right? There's this recognition that, he's just sort of like bitching, right? And there's nothing that could end this bitching, right? He's unappeasable, right? To what degree is this like depression something that is truly hated versus something that is, on some level, something that you kind of start to depend on. I mentioned this earlier, right? Killing with Chinese Bookie, when Ben Gazzara's character says, I'm only happy when I'm angry. I'm only happy when I'm sad. And, a lot of people function that way. I sometimes function that way. So we have, for anybody that says this is just disconnected bullshit, and trust me, if you look at some of the kind of like worst essays from the 60s and 70s, you're going to get a lot of that, right? Just show them like, well, explain to me dream song number 1, right? The first 2 lines, we have a setting of everything else, not only biographical, but for the purposes of, the poetry, for the purposes of the rest of the book. I see his point at trying to put things over, right? So the question is, who is the I, right? Is this the friend that Henry has that is sometimes in blackface, sometimes not? We know that the friend, right, the blackface character that calls Henry Mr. Bones. One of the reasons why I'm kind of uncomfortable calling it like generically blackface is, well, first of all, in every single case, right, this kind of like outer voice, that this friend, whatever, even if sometimes that is the I, even if the friend is sometimes the I, we get constantly this sense that this blackface character seems to have a ton of wisdom that Henry does not himself have. We already know that John Berryman is author, right? Like, where is he in relation to Henry? Where is he himself in these poems? Clearly, there is some kind of criticism here, right? This is not a positive kind of, description of this character. It was the thought that they could do it made Henry wicked in a way. But he should have come out and talked, right? So already, right, we see this kind of adversarial position, with other people. And we could say this, based on the biography alone. It's with friends, it's with, spouses, it's with students, it's with, faculty, it's with people that are older than him, younger than him. A constant kind of, adversarial kind of, position and antagonism. all the world, I find this pretty beautiful. All the world, like a woolen lover, once did seem on Henry's side. Um, think about that. All the world, like a woolen lover. Like, what is a woolen lover? Is it just the kind of like comfort of wool? And this is where you have to kind of step outside yourself. I personally hate the feeling of anything other than cotton. Everything I wear is cotton. But wool, I guess, is considered a liked enough fabric among many, like a woolen lover, right? A comforting lover, but also woolen, right? Like just think about this image, right? Woolen lover. Make whatever associations that you want, but factually speaking, the first image, right, in the most kind of superficial sense that you're supposed to see is, that part of the wool, right? There is this person, right? This lover, this whatever, that is made out of like some kind of fabric, some kind of material, which also means like this is also like the start perhaps of his undoing, right? The lover's undoing. Like all the world, like a woolen lover once did seem on Henry's side. So however comforting, right, this fabric might be, it can be sort of, pulled apart, I guess. So perhaps in some senses, what not Henry and not even the I, but maybe Berryman himself, like what the or like the over voice in the poem. Maybe we don't even have to say Berryman, but whatever the over voice of the poem is, maybe they're saying that even from the beginning, right? You sought comfort in love, you saw comfort in sex, you sought comfort in addiction, but from the very beginning, it was a woolen lover. It wasn't meant to stay. Right. And we get it. Then came a departure. What a beautiful little way to put that, right? All the world, like a woolen lover, once did seem on Henry's side. Mysterious line. Then came a departure, right? Nothing specific, right? This is where all the stuff about his dad comes in. Like all the critics that say this has to talk about the dad. Well, maybe, right? Maybe in the universe, right? In the cosmos of the poem, this is all about the dad. Maybe in Berryman's personal biography, the suicide of his father was an especially traumatic event that sort of, set him on the path that he ultimately went down upon. But here it's just non-specific. Like it's just generically so a departure. And this is where so much of the power comes in, right? When I say that the first poem sets the stage, we don't need to hear about the father. We hear about the father later on, but we don't need to hear about it just yet, right? Think of a movie, think of a novel, think of, anything that sort of, takes you on. In this case, it's going to be a 77 song journey. More comprehensively, 385. You need, this kind of start, right? You don't want necessarily something that specific. You want enough specifics, right? You want specifics about character. You want specifics about, understanding, I guess, the grammar of the writing. But you don't need to specifically have that this is like a dead dad. Not yet, right? But we have the biography. We could keep it in mind, and we'll keep in mind. We use it. There's utility there. Even again, we are starting to now sort of, rebut that a little bit. We need to butt heads there, right? We need to, rub against it in some way. Thereafter, nothing fell out as it might or ought. I don't see how Henry Pride, open for all the world to see, survived. Right. So sometimes we get this kind of rhyme. We get these kinds of like, I guess, askew and askance couplets. Sometimes there's no rhyme at all. Sometimes the poems are in fact like this, like 18 lines, right? Like when we were reading earlier that this is like, supposed to be Berryman's sort of, play on Shakespearean sonnets. The difference, of course, is that these are not sonnets. This is an 18-line poem. But, in terms of like imagining what, like covering this kind of ground, right? Like it's a lot harder to do with strict sonnets. Like the poet Don Moss has the book-length poem Dominions, which are these like really loose sonnets, right? And it really works for the context of that narrative. But even then, the sonnets have to be loose. Like I remember there's this one contemporary poet named what is it, V.S. Naipaul, who wrote this one novel. It's like a modern novel in verse. I think it was written either in the 90s or the 2000s. Very like technically nice to read, but it's not necessarily great writing. And even that like is constrained by the fact that it wants to be sort of, musical and nice, right? It wants to be much closer to a conventional sonnet than what a book length like set of poems demand, right? Which is why Don Moss's decision makes so much sense, right? And why John Berryman's decision here to do like most 18 lines. Sometimes it's like I think 20, 22 lines from what I recall. But structurally, like he doesn't pigeonhole himself too much. Like he sort of does in the sense that the syntax is different, the grammar is different, the kinds of words that he uses will be different, but structurally there's a lot of leeway here. You would be surprised doing it. Sometimes we'll see something like not even in terms of rhyme, but we'll see lines that you could still split up in like an A B way, and the A B does not refer to rhyme, right? It just refers to the length of a line, right? Which we also know that Berryman, like he was a great fan of for all the talk of like his editing of Shakespeare, he was a great fan of classical poetry. He was a great fan of especially Latin poetry. And with Latin poetry, you had the same sort of thing, right? You often had line lengths. You had the syllable. I'm not sure if I would call it in the same way that we think of like long and short syllables. Well, I guess it's somewhat similar in English, but if like rhyme is like rare in Latin poetry, right? You need like that A B thing that you learn in high school. The reason why it's necessary is you need some kind of variety, right? And whether like your line of demarcation is rhyme, whether your line of demarcation is going to be length, whether it's going to be a length of syllables or like vowels or whatever, you could choose whatever quote unquote arbitrary thing you want, right? You could choose whatever variable, and you could build like the poetry around that. Yeah, and this part, like, I don't see how Henry Pride, open for all the world to see, survived, right? So, this line, like the reference is what, right? Okay, so if we take it in this kind of most superficial sense of like this is Berryman's biography, I mean, everybody like in his personal life, like they knew of his problems, right? He was like constantly like drunk, right? He was constantly out of it. He was constantly getting divorced. He was constantly cheating on his wives. He was constantly, going in and out of like hospitals. So Pride in that sense, right? How could he survive that onslaught of eyes? Okay, that's the most superficial reading. Another dimension is, forget about the biography. We are now like putting Henry like into this book, right? We're positioning him here, and we are going to just, essentially allow much more so than like in a biographical sense, like the number of people that Berryman would know would be small, obviously, like compared to the number of people that would read them. Here, in the reading sense of that interpretation, we're going to put Henry for the entire world to see in the book, right? We're going to poke fun of him. We're going to somehow, slash him. We're going to put him in situations where he's maybe in some situations wise. In other situations, we have his friends that are critiquing him. So we're gonna do this thing that, again, superficially Berryman went through. We're gonna do it more substantively here, right? Because the sum of like your personal life, like if it's never written down, if it's never understood, if it's never contextualized, if it's never given anything other than you living it, it's never gonna get anywhere, right? But and surviving this, surviving this in literature in some senses will be even more difficult, right? Which is perhaps, again, going back to the foundation, maybe this is why Berryman was so attracted to it. What he has now to say is a long wonder what he has now to say is a long wonder the world can bear and be. So just think about how you could split that up grammatically, right? Like with enjambment, without enjambment, like you always want to sort of read with and without and see what the differences are. So what he has now to say is a long wonder, right? So long what? Like, is he going to bitch some more? Are we going to get, something that is like prototypically Henry? Or are we going to get, perhaps like this over voice chiming in and calling it what the rest of the kind of, poems will be, like a wonder and ambiguity, right? What he has now to say is a long wonder the world can bear and be. So is the world, somehow seemingly able to bear, but, we wonder why? Are we going to interpret this in some other way, right? So what he has now is a long wonder the world can bear and be. So like be in spite of like the complaints, right? This is like there's this line in War and Peace, and it's like I read War and Peace when I was 18 years old. I remember when I was reading, I was working at a pharmacy at the time. I was working in a pharmacy, making people their pills, and it was like a 90-minute train ride. Because at the time I was like living, I was living like 90 minutes from this place, and I would take like War and Peace with me, like 90 minutes there and back, right? So essentially, I would have 3 hours of reading, like by the time I would get home from work, which is kind of like like you always have time, right? People always got time. Like it's not there isn't time enough. You always have time in some ways to do what you need to do. Anyway, and I read this when I was 18 years old, and the only thing I remember about the book still is a paragraph where I forget the character, I forget who he was, but he's at some war. I think he's I think he's like facing a French soldier. He's a Russian character. And as he's facing down a French soldier, he has this feeling that, does this soldier really want to kill me? Like, is this actually true? Is this actually happening? Like, I guess you could sort of like imagine, like, the cliche of like your life flashing before your eyes or whatever. Time sort of slows down, and he's actively like thinking to himself, can this soldier possibly want to kill me? I think his name is Alyosha. The Alyosha, who is loved by so many, which is like, it's so, say what you will about Tolstoy in general, but I mean, it's a great paragraph and it's a great line, right? Like imagine in the heat of war being so kind of like war drunk that you have this thought, does this stranger actually want to kill me? I, who am loved, like at home by people who actually know me, and I'm going to have this like assumption in this like completely fucking like impersonal, impersonal situation, like a war. And, same thing here, like what he has now to say is a long wonder the world can bear and be. How can the world continue to be in the face of everything that huffy Henry has to deal with, right? Unappeasable Henry has to deal with, right? Everybody's trying to put everything over on you, Henry. So it's okay for you to sulk. It's a way for you to hide the day. It's okay for you to, imagine the world in some way revolves around you. Anyway, if I'm gonna take 30 minutes per song, I'm not trying to be here that long. Once in a sycamore, I was glad all the top, and I sang. Hard on the land wears a strong sea, and empty grows every bed. So, okay, we have the physical loss of the dad, perhaps. We have the physical loss of the spouses, perhaps. We have, this being an empty grows every bed. This could just be like just a standard stand-in for loneliness in general, right? This doesn't have to be a specific situation, right? Empty grows every bed, right? This is in the generalized sense, like loneliness coming to the world, not even necessarily because loneliness has come to the world, but lowliness has come to Henry's world, right? This is Henry's point of view. Even if the actual narrator stands outside of Henry, this is Henry's perception of that world. So in that way, again, Dream Song number 1, this sets to me, better than any other poem in the book, everything for the rest of the 77 as well as the rest of the 385 poems. So don't let anybody tell you that there is no direction, no order. Some things you're going to have to pick apart. You're going to have to put the pieces back together your way. But ultimately you have a guiding hand in the sense of Berryman ordering these from 1 to 385, right? That's not just